The airport terminal was a blur of movement. Passengers hustling through the maze of gates, airline staff rushing between counters, and the hum of overhead announcements filling the air. It was the kind of chaotic morning that travelers know too well. Long lines, last-minute check-ins, and the constant rush to make sure nothing was forgotten. The glass walls of the terminal framed a cloudy sky, hinting at an impending storm. But for now, the world inside felt entirely separate from anything outside. It was a place where the rhythms of travel took precedence over everything else. Among the sea of busy travelers stood a father and his young daughter. They weren't in any particular rush, taking their time as they navigated the airport with a calmness that stood in stark contrast to the chaos around them. The girl, no older than 10, was a burst of energy. She wore a bright, patterned dress that seemed to reflect her spirited personality, and her hair was neatly styled, pulled into a few tight braids. But it was a bag that truly set her apart, a colorful, hand-woven creation that spoke of heritage and tradition. It was a piece of her family's culture, a vibrant reminder of where she came from. The bag, decorated with intricate patterns and vibrant hues, carried significance far beyond its aesthetic appeal. As they approached the check-in counter, the father smiled down at his daughter, offering a reassuring hand on her shoulder. She beamed back at him, her eyes sparkling with confidence. But as they neared the counter, something shifted in the atmosphere. The airline staff, who had been chatting casually, suddenly fell silent as the girl placed her bag on the conveyor belt. A few looks were exchanged between them, their expressions hardening, and the tension was palpable. It was the first sign of something amiss. The father, sensing a change in tone, felt his stomach knot. As the girl's vibrant, hand-woven bag moved along the conveyor belt, the mood at the check-in counter shifted. The airline staff, a group of 3 young women in crisp uniforms, exchanged quick glances. At first, it was barely noticeable, a slight widening of the eyes, a shift in posture, but then the quiet whispers began. It started with one of the staff members, a tall woman with blonde hair, who leaned toward her colleagues. She muttered something inaudible, her lips curling into a small smirk. Her eyes flicked over the colorful bag, then back at her co-workers. The second staff member, a woman with sharp features and a neutral expression, barely held back a chuckle. She murmured something too, just loud enough for the others to hear. Is that even a real bag?" she whispered, the tone mocking. The third staff member, shorter and with dark hair, quickly joined in, her voice just above a whisper, but still laced with clear disdain. "Looks like something you'd find at a flea market. What's with the patterns?" The other two chuckled, their laughter thin and dismissive, barely hidden behind their smiles. The young girl stood there, holding her father's hand, her small face alight with curiosity, unaware of the conversation unfolding around her. She watched as her bag slowly slid toward the check-in scale, its bright colors clashing with the stark white of the airline's uniform counter. For a brief moment, she felt proud of it, proud of the craftsmanship and the story behind it. But then, something began to register. She saw the way the staff looked at the bag, the way their smiles turned into forced grins and whispered words. A small knot formed in her stomach. It didn't take her long to sense the discomfort creeping in. She wasn't sure why, but the atmosphere around her had changed. The quiet judgment felt heavy, and though she couldn't fully understand it, she instinctively knew that something wasn't right. She glanced up at her father, hoping for reassurance, but he was busy chatting with another staff member. The girl looked back down at her bag. Her heart sank as she heard another remark, this one louder, as one of the staff members leaned across the counter toward the others. "I bet that thing doesn't even fit in the overhead bin," she said with a mocking laugh. The others snickered again, their voices filled with condescension. In that instant, the girl's confidence faltered. Her eyes dropped to the floor, and her grip on her father's hand tightened. She wanted to ask if it was something wrong with her bag, but she didn't know how. She felt a wave of shame wash over her, an unfamiliar feeling that made her stomach twist. It wasn't until the staff's laughter became a little too loud and their smirks a little too obvious that the father noticed. His hand instinctively tightened on his daughter's shoulder, the slight shift in his demeanor alerting him to the discomfort in the air. He turned his attention to the check-in counter and immediately saw the way the staff were looking at his daughter's bag, mocking, dismissive, and filled with something that made his blood run cold. Without fully understanding what had just transpired, the father's protective instincts kicked in. His expression hardened and he leaned down, asking his daughter in a soft, concerned voice, "Sweetheart, what's wrong? You're not feeling scared, are you?" The young girl hesitated, her eyes flicking nervously toward the counter. After a long pause, she spoke quietly, her voice trembling. "Daddy, they were laughing at my bag." Her voice cracked slightly, and her eyes filled with confusion and hurt. A cold wave of anger surged through the father. He had lived his whole life trying to earn respect, fighting against prejudice and discrimination at every turn. But this was different. This wasn't just a stranger making assumptions about him. This was his daughter, his little girl, the person he'd promised to protect above all else, now feeling the sting of mockery and racial judgment. He had always believed that the world was moving forward, that things were getting better. But in that moment, seeing the hurt in his daughter's eyes, he felt the raw sting of reality. His internal dialogue was a storm of conflicting emotions. He was angry, no, furious, at the blatant disrespect his daughter had been subjected to. He was hurt that his daughter had to experience such insidious mockery so young. But there was something else rising within him, too, a fierce, determined sense of justice. He couldn't stand by and let this go. Not for his daughter. Not for anyone. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. As a father, he'd always been patient, always tried to rise above the noise of small-minded people. But today, he wasn't going to let this moment pass without action. Something inside him had broken, and he couldn't let his daughter feel less than because of someone else's ignorance. The father didn't waste a moment. As soon as his daughter's words sank in, he stood up straighter, his body tense with the decision he had already made. He wasn't going to let this go, not in front of his daughter, not in front of anyone who might think that this kind of treatment was acceptable. He gave his daughter a reassuring squeeze on the shoulder, then walked toward the counter with a calm, deliberate stride, his steps steady and measured. The airline staff, still unaware of the father's growing anger, continued to converse amongst themselves, their condescending whispers now just barely audible to the nearby passengers. As the father approached, they immediately stopped speaking and turned to face him, their expressions shifting from casual to cautious. They had not expected anyone to challenge their behavior. The father's presence was commanding, though not threatening. He stood tall, eyes level with the staff, his voice carrying the weight of quiet authority. He addressed the woman who had made the loudest mockery first, speaking directly to her without raising his tone. "Excuse me," he began, his voice measured yet firm. "I couldn't help but overhear the comments you and your colleagues made about my daughter's bag. I'd like to know why you thought it was appropriate to mock her personal belongings." There was a brief silence. The woman's face flushed, and she began to stammer, trying to come up with some sort of response. But the father didn't let her off the hook. He held her gaze unwavering, before turning his attention to the others. The other staff members looked uncomfortable now, shifting their weight, avoiding eye contact. "Let me make one thing clear," the father continued, his voice growing in strength. "My daughter's bag is a piece of her heritage. It is a part of who she is. So, when you make fun of it, you are making fun of her, and you are making fun of her culture. Is that something you all are willing to stand by?" The tension in the terminal was palpable. Passengers waiting in line began to notice the exchange. Some of them paused mid-step, looking over with interest, while others exchanged glances, curious to see what would happen next. A few pulled out their phones, silently recording, while others whispered among themselves. There was a palpable shift in the atmosphere, a collective holding of breath, as if everyone was waiting for the father's next words to either escalate the situation or bring it to a close. The father's voice softened slightly, but the power in his words was undeniable. Respect is not just something that should be expected from others. It's something that should be given freely. Prejudice, even in its smallest forms, has a ripple effect. It teaches people to devalue others, to overlook the richness of different cultures, and to accept that some lives, some traditions, are worth less than others. He paused, his gaze moving over the group of staff members and then to the passengers around them. What you did was not just a harmless joke. It was an example of a larger issue, one that perpetuates inequality, and I won't allow it to go unchecked, especially when it affects my daughter. The weight of his words hung in the air. The staff members stood frozen, their eyes wide, realizing the gravity of the situation. The passengers who had been watching started to nod, some murmuring quietly in agreement. The father wasn't shouting. His words didn't need volume to make their impact. Every syllable was a quiet but forceful challenge to the ingrained biases that had caused the situation to unfold in the first place. As a parent, my responsibility is to raise my child and know her worth, to know that she is important, her culture is important, and that no one, not anyone, has the right to diminish that. The father continued, his gaze steady. And as long as I am standing here, no one will make my daughter feel small for something she cannot control. Not in my presence. There was a long silence, as the weight of the father's words settled over everyone in the terminal. The airline staff had no response. No more laughter, no more dismissive comments. They stood there, humbled, their faces flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and guilt. Some passengers, who had been silent until then, began to quietly applaud. Others exchanged glances of approval, their discomfort at the situation now giving way to a quiet solidarity with the father. The father gave one last, steady look at the airline staff before turning back to his daughter, offering her a smile. "Let's get your bag checked in," he said, his voice softer now but still firm. He placed a hand on her shoulder, and together they moved forward, leaving the stunned staff and onlookers behind. The silence in the air was thick, the weight of the father's words still lingering, heavy on everyone in the terminal. For a moment, the airline staff stood frozen, their faces flushed with embarrassment and shame. They hadn't expected this kind of confrontation, nor had they anticipated the father's calm yet powerful response. But the moment stretched on, and the tension was palpable. Finally, the woman who had made the first mocking comment cleared her throat. Her voice faltered slightly as she spoke, her tone apologetic but lacking sincerity. I'm so sorry," she began, her words stumbling out. "We didn't mean any harm. It was just a joke, nothing personal." Her eyes darted around, trying to gauge the situation. But her apology felt more like a defensive attempt to brush the matter aside than an expression of genuine regret. The father didn't flinch. He stood tall, unrelenting, his arms crossed in front of him. "A joke?" he asked, his voice cool but resolute. "What you said was not a joke. It was disrespectful. It was an example of how ingrained prejudices can manifest in the most casual ways. And while you may have thought it was harmless, my daughter felt it, and that's something you need to understand." The staff member looked down, her face flushing deeper. The others remained silent, perhaps unsure of what to say next. The father, however, wasn't finished. He pressed on, his tone unwavering. "You see, it's not enough to simply apologize because you got caught. An apology means nothing unless it's paired with an understanding of why what happened was wrong in the first place. This isn't about a mistake. It's about a lack of respect. If you want to apologize, I need to hear that you understand the impact of your actions." The staff members exchanged glances, unsure of how to proceed. The father's words hung in the air, unyielding, and finally, the woman who had made the initial remark spoke again, her voice lower this time. "You're right," she said, her tone now more sincere. "We didn't think about it that way. I didn't realize how harmful it was. We were wrong, and I truly apologize." The other staff members nodded in agreement, though their faces still bore the signs of their discomfort. They had been called out, forced to confront their own biases, and the realization was sinking in slowly. The apology, though initially lacking, was beginning to carry more weight as they came to terms with the gravity of the situation. A shift had started to occur, not just between the father and the staff, but throughout the airport terminal. The passengers who had been silently watching the exchange now began to react. One elderly man, who had been standing near the check-in counter, cleared his throat and spoke up. "I agree with him," he said, his voice carrying a note of authority. "It's important to treat everyone with respect, regardless of what they look like or where they come from. I've seen too much of this kind of thing in my life." A few others nodded in agreement, and the father's stance seemed to inspire them. Slowly but surely, more passengers began to voice their support. A woman standing in line with her young son added, "It's not just about a bag. It's about how we all deserve to be treated with dignity." Her words were simple but firm, and they resonated with those around her. Some passengers, who had been quietly observing, now moved forward, standing just behind the father. They were adding their voices to the growing call for change. They weren't shouting or confronting anyone directly, but their quiet solidarity was undeniable. In the space of just a few minutes, the mood in the terminal had shifted from tension to something more unified. There was a collective sense of support for the father and his daughter, as if the group, once scattered in their individual concerns, had come together for a shared cause, to challenge disrespect, even in its smallest forms. The staff members, visibly shaken, now stood silently. The air was thick with reflection, the realization dawning on them that this moment wasn't just a small confrontation. It was a moment of teaching, a chance to reflect on the deeper issues of prejudice and cultural respect. The father, sensing the shift, nodded once to the staff members. "Apologies are only the beginning," he said, his voice steady. "I hope you'll take this lesson with you, not just as a moment of discomfort, but as an opportunity to grow." As the father and daughter made their way to the gate, the atmosphere in the terminal had undeniably changed. The once tense scene now felt lighter, more unified. The exchange had sparked something deeper, a recognition that respect isn't just something given when convenient. It's a standard that should be held by everyone at all times. And as the father walked away, he could feel the weight lifting off his shoulders, knowing he had stood up not only for his daughter, but for everyone who had ever faced similar disrespect. As the father and daughter walked away from the check-in counter, the noise of the airport seemed to fade into the background. They moved through the terminal in a calm, shared silence, the weight of what had just happened settling around them. The father kept his hand on his daughter's shoulder, feeling her small, delicate frame beside him. It was as though the air had cleared, not just for them, but for everyone who had witnessed the exchange. The girl glanced up at her father, her eyes wide with a mix of admiration and curiosity. She could sense the change, the shift in the atmosphere, but also the tenderness in the way he walked beside her. As they found a quiet corner near the departure gate, the father paused, kneeling down to her level. He looked into her eyes, his voice soft but full of purpose. "Sweetheart," he began, his voice steady, "what happened back there doesn't define who you are. It doesn't define your bag, your culture, or your story. You are so much more than that. What those people said, it was wrong, but it doesn't make you any less valuable. You carry something powerful inside you, your heritage, your spirit, your uniqueness. No one can take that away." The young girl looked down at her bag, still tightly clutched in her small hands. She had held on to it during the entire confrontation, like a lifeline. She had felt so confused and small in that moment of mockery. But her father's words wrapped around her like a warm embrace, soothing the hurt she hadn't fully understood at the time. She nodded slowly, the corners of her mouth curving up into a small smile. There was a quiet strength behind her eyes now, a newfound resilience. "Thanks, Dad," she whispered, her voice steady but soft. "I feel okay now." The father gave her a small nod, brushing a stray braid from her face. He could see that she was starting to understand not just the significance of what had happened, but how powerful it was to stand up for what was right. The father stood up, taking her hand gently once again. They shared a brief, silent moment of connection, an unspoken understanding passing between them. As they moved toward the gate, the world around them felt different. The once tense situation, filled with mockery and discomfort, had transformed into something more meaningful. Passengers who had watched the confrontation unfold were now moving through the terminal with a sense of solidarity, some even offering the father a nod of approval. There was a collective, quiet recognition that standing up for respect and dignity was more than just a noble act. It was necessary. It wasn't about confrontation for the sake of conflict, but about affirming the importance of everyone's humanity. The girl walked with a little more bounce in her step now, her head held a little higher. The weight of the situation, which had initially crushed her confidence, was now lifting. She felt empowered. She had witnessed firsthand the power of standing up for what is right, and it was a lesson she would carry with her always. As they neared their gate, the father looked down at his daughter, offering a reassuring smile. "Let's take this journey together, okay?" he said. She nodded, her smile now full and genuine. "Together," she agreed, her voice firm with new understanding. And as they walked hand in hand toward their boarding gate, the incident that had once threatened to define their experience had instead become a powerful moment of growth. The lesson, not just for them but for everyone who had witnessed it, was clear. Respect is something to be given, not earned. The incident didn't end with an apology. It ended with a reminder that cultural respect, dignity, and the strength to stand up for one another are values worth fighting for. The lesson of this story goes beyond a simple confrontation at an airport. It's about standing up when faced with injustice, no matter how small or subtle it may seem. In a world where discrimination can often be cloaked in quiet mockery or thoughtless remarks, this father and daughter's experience reminds us of the importance of integrity, dignity, and respect. The father's unwavering support for his daughter and his refusal to let disrespect slide demonstrated that sometimes the smallest actions can have the most profound impact. This story serves as a powerful reminder that standing up for what's right requires courage and, at times, vulnerability. It's not enough to remain silent when we witness unfair treatment. Just as the father spoke up on behalf of his daughter, we too have a responsibility to speak out when we see others being wronged. It's about more than just correcting a wrong in the moment. It's about changing the narrative, teaching others the importance of cultural respect, and standing in solidarity with those who are marginalized. As the father taught his daughter, the value of standing up for yourself and others isn't just in challenging injustice. It's in reinforcing the belief that everyone deserves to be treated with the same respect and dignity, regardless of their background. This story leaves us with a question. How will we respond when we see others being treated unfairly? Will we stand by in silence, or will we step forward as the father did to challenge prejudice and offer support? The power to make a difference is within us all, and every moment is an opportunity to show that we value integrity and respect for all.